Welcome everyone. It's absolutely brilliant to be here and get back to more in-person events after so long, and I'm particularly excited to chair this property panel today. Jace mentioned the contribution of the built environment. We know that it contributes to about 40% of global emissions, which is a huge amount, so it's certainly part of the problem, but it's also part of the solution, and you'll hear a lot about those solutions this morning. So we've got a brilliant panel of speakers today, and I'll introduce you to them now. So firstly, as Jace mentioned, we've got Damien Hemmings, Interim Head of the Climate Emergency Programme at Westminster City Council. So Damien is responsible for overseeing Westminster's transition to be a net zero carbon council by 2030, as well as ensuring the City of Westminster achieves its net zero carbon by 2040 goals as well. So welcome, Damien. Then we have Dr. Timur Talioglu. Sorry, Timur, I knew I was going to get that wrong. You can correct us in a minute. And Timur is a partner at Montagu and has particular experience in advising on major regeneration projects involving listed buildings, so we'll be sure to come back to that question from that panel before, sensitive landscapes and conservation areas as well. Then I'm also delighted to have Janine. Janine Cole is the Sustainability and Social Impact Director from GPE. Janine is responsible for the development and implementation of their sustainability strategy, driving the creation of social value in the business and ensuring health and well-being is front and centre of building design. And Janine also chairs the Better Buildings Partnership as well. And last but by no means least, we've got John Davies, Head of Sustainability at Derwent, London. And John is responsible for leading the company-wide sustainability and responsibility agendas. So there is our brilliant panel, and thank you all in advance this morning. So I'm going to get stuck straight into questions, but before I do, can I just remind you that we are going to have time for some audience questions as well. So do think about what some of your questions will be as we go through the panel this morning. So, Damien, starting with you. So, in order to have a sustainable future, we need to ensure planning policy supports that ambition. What planning frameworks are in place to ensure future developments and retrofits in the West End are sustainable?
Thanks, Tor. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to join the panel. Obviously, very topical conversation and questions already around this subject. I think it's important, just before I go into touch on the planning framework, is just to really kind of highlight the context and the scale of the challenge that we're facing. Tor's already mentioned the net zero targets that we've set out as an organisation, and for the citywide approach to achieve net zero by 2040. Within Westminster, as a city, we produce over 2.2 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent each year, which is a considerable amount, and in fact the largest amount of any local authority area within London. Within that, buildings produce the overwhelming contribution towards that, so 86% of emissions are produced from the built environment. Around 73% of that is the non-domestic building. So obviously a significant contribution towards that, and a significant role to play in achieving those targets. In terms of buildings, obviously we can't understate the role that they can play, and that can be delivered both through new development, through retrospectively improving the building stock that we already have, and obviously through the operation and use of current buildings as well. And within the planning context and the planning framework, that obviously has an important role to play. And from a city council perspective, we're looking at how we can move forward on the sustainability agenda in the planning policy framework through a number of areas. The first of those is the city plan, which is the statutory planning document for the city. It sets out the range of policies, not just on sustainability, but on every aspect of development that sets and guides the requirements and expectations for new development in the city through to 2040. Within that, some of the specific environment policies are around energy and the requirement for all major domestic and non-domestic development to achieve net zero carbon standards in line with the London Plan and the Greater London Authority's requirements. Also, we have principles around sustainable design, which is looking to promote and encourage the longevity of buildings, so reuse and refurbishment to ensure that the infrastructure that's already there can be used and is fit for purpose for the future. Secondly, and to supplement the city plan, is the recently released Environmental Supplementary Planning Document, or ESPD for short. And this really looks to provide further detailed guidance on environment and sustainability issues, building on those set out in the city plan. So within this, it looks to further expand on what we mean by net zero carbon. And in fact, we look to align with the Green Building Council's framework definition on net zero, both for operational and embodied carbon. We also set out some recommendations and minimum performance requirements for new development, again signalling to some excellent work that's been undertaken by the London Energy Transformation Initiative, setting out some recommended minimum performance standards for new buildings. And also we provide further guidance on retrofitting and measures and what permissions and further considerations need to be considered in that context. Obviously, this is incredibly important because most of the buildings that will exist in 2040 have already been built, so it comes back to this issue of looking at how we can retrospectively improve those buildings to be fit for a zero carbon future. And then thirdly is a guidance and code of construction practice that sets out the steps and expectations for developers and those undertaking major construction or refurbishment within the city, and the steps that they need to take in order to reduce their environmental impact and also to reduce the impact on local stakeholders, neighbours, residents, etc. So across those suite of policies, it really sets out the approach that we're looking to take in terms of environmental sustainability. It's worth highlighting that obviously a lot of work can take place outside of the planning policy framework as well. Many retrofit measures don't actually require planning permission, therefore the planning framework isn't necessarily an impediment to those going forward. And in that space, it's really important to recognise the opportunities for collaboration and shared learning, and that's something that we're really looking to encourage, to share that best practice and understanding where buildings can be improved and taken forward, where we can work collectively to try and leverage the necessary investment to move the built environment forward, and how we can look to share that learning going forward so that the built environment is fit for purpose and fit for a net zero future.
Brilliant. Thanks, Damien. So Westminster very much here to support and help occupiers and landlords to reach their net zero goals. So moving on to Tamir, you're advising clients all the time on listed buildings, heritage buildings and sustainability. What advice are you giving them, particularly in the West End, to help navigate net zero ambitions when dealing with historic buildings?
Well, firstly, again, I'd like to say thank you for the opportunity for being here, because your question goes to, well, the heart of your question really is that heritage and sustainability are probably more entwined now than they ever have been. And I'm sitting on a panel with 3 experts in sustainability, and probably 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago, we wouldn't have been in this position. And that's a fundamental aspect that's now going to be moving forward, and it's a step change. And in the West End, that issue really is brought into sharp focus by 2 statistics, many of which people in this room will have heard before, but I think it's important to repeat. The first is there are 11,000 listed buildings in Westminster. That's roughly 2% of all of the listed buildings in the country. And for those who are doing the quick maths, there's about 500,000 listed buildings in the country. That's a significant number. The other important statistic is in Westminster, 78% of the area, that's about 16.5 square kilometres, is covered by conservation areas. And if you then close in on the West End, Oxford Street in particular, I can only think of a small pocket to the north and south that aren't covered by some form of heritage designation. Now, in some ways, that's of course the right thing, because heritage and historic buildings and the historic places in Westminster, in the West End, we have some of the most iconic buildings here, and they contribute immensely to the rich vibrancy and culture that is the reason why we all work in the West End, why tourists come here. And that's the right thing. And heritage forms part of the DNA as well. I think we would all sort of agree that point, I would hope. But what's interesting is a lot of those buildings, whether they were Georgian or Victorian or 20th century, weren't built at a time when there is a clear climate emergency and where there's clear action. And if we're not careful, some of the listed buildings in particular could become museum pieces because they need to be adapted, they need to move. Otherwise, as we've already heard, people are already voting with their feet. Businesses are already making decisions based on energy efficiency and ESG and other ethical and right ethical decisions. And if people feel that they can't invest in listed buildings because of the issues and because of the issues around adaptability, well, frankly, they may lose their position as being that fundamental part of the West End as I've just been describing. So you've asked me, what advice am I giving my clients? Well, first of all, I'm saying don't underestimate the sustainability question at the moment because the two are so entwined. And aim high, because you might just get there. I'm doing a scheme in East London at the moment with a developer who is fairly well known to most, but the aim there, where we're taking historic structures, is we're aiming for really high levels of sustainability and energy performance. Let's just see where we get to. It might not work out in the end, but that's the starting point. The good news is conservation and retrofit, it has been going on for 150 years. William Morris established the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings in 1877. Particularly since the 1990s, refurbishment of listed buildings is something we've all been doing. Everyone on this panel has been involved with historic building refurbishment projects, so that's not new. What's new is how the more challenging points that I'll come on to in just a second. The other points I would say are we're in a mature and forward-thinking local authority. The conservation officers have changed their names, their titles from conservation to conservation and sustainability. That tells you more about what I've been talking about. And there's already there's a plethora of advice for people who are looking at retrofit. There's the Letty retrofit guidance, there's the Oxford Heritage Energy Efficiency Tool, there's the Westminster SPD on sustainability, environmental SPD, and there's Historic England guidance. Now, the issue is that that's all in different places, and it's not easy for people to get to, so there is a piece of bringing that together. But let's not beat around the bush, there are challenges, and this goes to the question, I think, that we heard earlier. There are significant challenges because we have to question the art of the possible with listed buildings, particularly, and question some of the norms around the approaches to conservation. 2 years ago, I would never have advised a client to put in double glazing in a listed building. It would have been a flat no in most local authorities. Today, the technology has moved on such that the aesthetic and that character can be preserved. There are many more questions that we'll have to ask. The second point then is the friction and the conflict between conservation and statutory protection versus the need and the importance of sustainability. And if you draw a graph, and I'll draw it this way for the audience, conservation sort of since the 1990s and the importance and time this way and the importance has sort of done this. And you've seen in many appeal decisions, in planning decisions, refusals on the basis of harm to listed buildings. I think in the last 2 years, the sustainability has done this, and we're sort of colliding now. And we're now at a really important juncture where we have to question whether some of the policy and some of the statutory and some of the knowledge base is right. Because the aspirations in policy for net zero and for energy efficiency are absolutely correct, but there is certainly within certain areas, there isn't the knowledge to be able to question whether the protection of historic buildings there should be a bit more flex. And then finally is this point on the knowledge gap, which is this is a really changing, fast-moving area in this area of planning practice. We're all having to upskill, and I think that's a point. And so there's a point of how we can all share information, and I'm sure we'll talk about and project learnings, and I'm sure we'll talk about that in due course.
Brilliant, thank you. So lots of tips for where to get some expert guidance from for your listed buildings. So moving on to Janine. Janine, we've got a room full of lots of occupiers today. How can you support the management of your buildings and your occupiers to enable the sustainability agenda to continue beyond the development phase?
Thanks, Tor, and good morning, everybody. I think just to set a bit of context, so in common with a number of other property owners, as part of the Better Buildings Partnership climate commitment, we set out our net zero carbon roadmap last year, and our customers' carbon footprint or carbon emissions within our buildings forms a significant part of our Scope 3 emissions. And so from a reducing our carbon footprint perspective, it's really important that we work together with our customers to bring down those carbon emissions. But I think actually more importantly than that, you can have all the sustainability badges in the world for a building when you deliver it on at practical completion, but if it doesn't perform efficiently when it's in use, then the reality is we're not delivering for our customers. And so what we really need to do is work closely with our customers from the off, and I actually think that making sure that our buildings work for them when they move in starts actually right at the very beginning when we're still in sort of design phases. Sometimes we're fortunate enough to know who's going to occupy our buildings when we're at design stages, and so having those initial meetings to talk about what's our customers' aspirations, talk to them about our sustainability ambitions is absolutely key. Green leases were mentioned earlier on. I think they're helpful in setting out an intent. I think the issue with green leases is that they often don't have an awful lot of teeth, because often the person signing the green lease is not the person who'll be talking to us about how much energy their space is consuming, and so they frequently won't know what's being included within a lease. So actually, communication and getting to know our customers is also a really important part of that process. I think the handover of buildings and commissioning is also really important. And there are a variety of ways in which we can help that process and tackle it. And again, involving our customers at that point in time really sort of helps to, I guess, improve the landing for our customers. And I think sort of technology. So lots of us are starting to implement building management systems, monitoring management processes where we can understand what's being switched on, when it shouldn't be on, what's coming on at midnight, when it doesn't need to be on at midnight. But then also exploring other sort of technological solutions. We have an app that allows us to give real-time data to our customers on energy consumption. But also what it also allows us to do is, so from an office customer's perspective, what's the sort of desk utilisation across their spaces, so that we can help in actually understanding what areas of the buildings we can perhaps switch the lights off. So, you know, sort of solutions such as that, and again, so usable data that our customers can start to use. But I think getting back to that communication point, what we started to do as well is set up energy working groups within our buildings, so that, you know, energy costs, as we all know, are escalating really quickly. So we're not just talking to them about carbon emissions, it's also about how can we really help you, you know, reduce those sort of overheads that are connected to energy. So again, really important for us to do that. But it's not just about carbon. It's also about how can we work with them on health and well-being. So during the pandemic, we installed air quality sensors throughout our buildings. Again, the app that we have can start to give that data to our customers. That's really important for them to be able to talk to their own employees about sort of the buildings that they're sort of coming to work in every day. And then also, you know, even from a biodiversity point of view, when you design a building, you typically design it for all eventualities. So a recent example, so Hanover Square, which obviously just down the road, that building went into planning in 2014. And so at that point, you design it for all types of occupiers because you've got no idea at that point in time who your customer is going to be. So actually that sort of settling in of customers and really talking to them as we start to go through lease negotiations is so important. And since they've settled into the building, they've started to talk to us about how can we increase the biodiversity there. There's a lot there already, but so in response to one of our customers' queries, we've now brought in beehives. Their employees wanted it, we've now delivered it. And I think that sort of ongoing communication is so important. We're fortunate enough to manage our own buildings, so we can continue to have those conversations. And I think that it's, as we are, move further on into this climate crisis, we can't solve this on our own, and we have to solve it together with our customers.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Janine. I think the landlord-tenant relationship is so important. I think previously occupiers cared much more about just the building they're in and not who their landlord is, and I hope we'll start to transition to see, so occupiers care much more about who they're working in partnership with, as well as what the building is as well. So it's some brilliant points. Thanks, Janine. John, moving on to you. So Derwent also has ambitions to be net zero carbon by 2030. What are you putting in place now to ensure that you can achieve that?
Thank you very much. Great question. I don't know if I can do this is what they said type thing before, but and good morning, everybody. So yes, like our others on the panel and previously, we've committed to be a net zero carbon business by 2030. So like Janine, we released our pathway back in 2020, actually July 2020, which set out how we were intending to step into the journey and what we were looking to set out. And I think it covers so many different things. And I think we could all be here for a very, very long time trying to describe the detail. But what I wanted to pick up on was a couple of points that Timmer was raising, and likewise Janine, in terms of some of the big issues that we as a landlord have to deal with, and potentially some of the issues that go unseen or unnoticed. Because as Tor mentioned, the tenant-landlord relationship, as it's called, we even have a Tenant Act of 1954. We have a piece of legislation which sets out exactly what a tenant is and what a tenant is able to do, and us as a landlord what we're able to do. But it's interesting that the way that sets the tone of a relationship. It's a really, really interesting one, because if anybody's ever rented a property in their lifetime, whether it's a flat or a house or anything like that, so you sign your tenancy agreement and step away and you move in and it's all great and you pay your rent. But what would happen if the landlord suddenly turned up one day, knocked on the door and sort of said, "Can I come have a look in your lounge?" And you think to yourself, "Why would you want to go do that?" And all of a sudden they start saying, "Well, that TV, I really don't think you've got the right level of energy efficiency on your TV. I really think you should change your light bulbs there because they're not LED." And you're thinking, "Oh, hang on a second, this is my house, this is my space, not yours. What gives?" And that's kind of the sort of the environment where at the moment, as tenants and landlords in that relationship, we're having to sort of negotiate. And the net zero carbon journeys and pathways that we've set out have intended to try and meet that head on. And it sort of brings two emotions to mind from my respect. I don't know how Janine and Tor feel about this, but it's a sort of slight fear and trepidation in one hand, and sort of a slight element of mild panic in terms of how do we address this issue? Because as landlords, the tenant emissions that come from their day-to-day activities, computers, photocopiers, meeting rooms, the heating and cooling that everybody uses, we have to account for. And we account for it in this bucket known as Scope 3. So Scope 3 effectively is the things that are associated with our business, but we don't, as landlords, do ourselves. But we have to account for them. And when you account for them, the numbers look really scary in comparison to your own. Your own looks fairly manageable, and all of a sudden you've got this enormous hotspot. So you think to yourselves, well, how are we going to tackle this? Because we have a piece of legislation, we have a contract which isn't actually helping us step into the relationship. So we've heard some fantastic examples here from retailing and from hospitality about almost an instantaneous engagement point with the customer. You can go and you've almost got a common ground that you can come to. But in terms of a tenant landlord, that doesn't exist at the moment. So one of the things that we've certainly been thinking about, and we've actually done, as the property industry, we're not actually very good at R&D. We're not very good at focus groups. We're not really good at doing that sort of thing. So we're having to become better, and that's another interesting sort of side effect of net zero. It's actually pushing us to look at different solutions. And as Timmer mentioned about the relationship between sort of sustainability and conservation, it's almost the point where the two have to come together and work together in order to be successful. And we're having to do that. So we're actually having to go and ask occupiers, tenants, customers, what is it that you want? What is it that you are doing? And how can us as a landlord support or indeed, make your experience better? So we've started to survey our occupier base specifically around net zero, because one of the other things that we're trying not to do is trying not to double count. So we have a range of occupiers, like we all do as landlords. Some 2, 3, 4, 5 people through to 3, 4, 5,000 people in buildings. Very different organisations, blue chip multinationals through to small startups. And what we're finding and what we found is at both ends of the spectrum, they have net zero ambitions. They're setting targets, they've got ambitions, they want to move on, they want to progress. So in amongst all that, how do we as Derwent London, and likewise how do we as other property companies, how do we enable that? So we've done that first part of the test. We've dipped our toe in the water and said, okay, well, how ambitious is everybody else? Unfortunately, most people have come back and said we're equally as ambitious. Next stage of the journey is to say, right, okay, we need to start making good on the ambition. So the next stage in our journey is actually sitting down with everybody and saying, right, how do we make this happen? So that will happen across a number of different planes. So whether it's energy efficiency, as Janine has mentioned, whether it's health and well-being, whether it's about technology, whether it is about green leases, or even the fact, do we need a green lease? Is it just having a leasing structure which enables stuff to happen, regardless of what the subject matter may or may not be? And then likewise, how do we together account for carbon? Because that's the other difficulty that we've got, is we've got lots of numbers. People don't necessarily know what the numbers mean. Are they put in the right places, and are they doing the right sorts of things with those numbers? And then ultimately come to the netting part. How do we show a reduction from X to Y? And then ultimately what is left as the residual carbon emissions that ultimately we have to net off somehow. And that netting can take a number of different forms. It could be offsetting, could be insetting, could be some kind of other transformative activity which helps balance out or indeed neutralise that carbon. So again, there's a number of steps we've got to go. The slight fear and panic comes in is that we're in 2022, so we've got 8 years to go. And as we know, things don't necessarily happen very quickly, particularly in our world. We take a long time to think and sort of work out, is that the best way to do something, and are we doing the right thing? And we know that we're going to go down a few blind alleys because that's just what happens on a journey. So that's where we're sort of thinking about it currently. And then there's also other areas which we're involved with, as Janine also mentioned, about things like how we develop new buildings, how we refurbish existing ones, and as previously mentioned, how do we look at decarbonising the buildings that we've got? So what that means in English is basically how do we move away from fossil fuels, so using gas to create your hot water and your heat in your buildings, in our buildings. That presents a whole range of interesting issues, which then links into the piece around sort of conservation. So if we're dealing with older buildings, not necessarily ones that are listed or have some kind of interest, but just older buildings in general, from say the 50s all the way through to the 80s, how do we get those buildings performing well? Because ultimately the majority of the carbon emissions come from existing buildings. It's not necessarily the new things that we're bringing online. So there's a whole heap of things that sort of sit within that. So again, there's a whole suite of activities that we've got within our pathway, which is we're trying to break all those down into sort of small manageable chunks and work through them as sequentially as we can. But ultimately it kind of sort of stitches together a lot of what's been said here today. And the one piece as well that also want to touch on before I finish is this bit around data and technology. As I sort of said, we're not really great in the sort of the property world on R&D and sort of, sort of future-proofing our assets, because it's very difficult to do. As Janine mentioned, we're trying to sort of second-guess the market in potentially 5 or 10 years' time. So naturally, we're not necessarily as tuned in as we should be. Versus, say, a technology company who are trialling the latest phones, computers, whatever it is, 5 or 6 generations down the line, while we're still using the current one, for example. So we're beginning to try and sort of get data and tech to help us to try and solve some of those problems. And for some people in the room thinking, well, why shouldn't you should be using data already? Yes, we should, but for us it's a bit of a slower learning curve. But trying to use that to help solve some of those problems around energy efficiency, around simple things like turning off the lights, or indeed air quality, health and well-being, or indeed how we simply market a building as well. So yeah, lots to do.
Yeah. We're going to be busy.
Only got 8 years. Yeah.
So as just heard from John, that partnership approach between landlord and tenant is, going to be absolutely vital going forward. And I'm a big advocate for getting rid of the word landlord, because I think it absolutely should be seen as a partnership. So thanks very much, John. Right, coming back to you, Damien, we've heard a lot this morning about the importance of collaboration. Can you give us an example of how Westminster are collaborating with local businesses to create a greener Westminster?
Yeah, certainly. Thanks, Dor. I think this leads on perfectly, actually, from the point that John was making in terms of the landlord-tenancy dynamic and trying to ensure that we're all on the same page and kind of moving in the same direction. I think one of the areas of work that you yourself will be very familiar with, Tor, is in looking to try and develop and launch a sustainable city charter for Westminster. So this is around trying to set the benchmarks and set out parameters across a range of sustainability categories and areas that the businesses and landlords can both look to adopt sustainable practices, look to try and cut their carbon emissions and find some element of common ground to address some of those the issues around the landlord and tenancy dynamic. So through the charter, obviously this is a kind of Westminster-focused approach to try and engender wider support and encourage businesses of all sizes to consider how they can address their environmental impact. We've already heard today that there are a range of other schemes as well, in terms of Race to Zero, often favours more of the larger business. So I think one of the really nice things about the charter is the opportunity for businesses of all size, for landlords and tenants, or tenants to both get on board and demonstrate their support for the net zero 2040 target. If they can achieve that in advance of 2040, terrific. There's no kind of limits in that respect to the ambition. But the charter is one way that we're really trying to bring those people together as a collective to demonstrate the work that they're doing and to collaborate and share learning. Obviously, in terms of the New West End company's climate commitment as well set out in the strategy, the charter features there, and they're looking to target, I think, 66% take-up by 2026, which would be terrific. So again, that's something that we're wholly encourage and looking to work collectively and collaboratively to move forward on.
Brilliant. Thanks, Damien.
I should probably mention actually in terms of kind of next steps, so we formed some working groups at the moment, and we're looking to have some further roundtable discussions throughout May. So I think if businesses are interested in taking part of those, they can of course express an interest, and keen to get as many people involved as possible, with a view to launching the charter in the summer, and then hopefully a supporting toolkit to follow alongside that a bit later in the year as well.
Brilliant, there we go. An open invitation from this morning. Janine and John, are there any other examples of collaboration that sort of go beyond our buildings? Obviously we all have to collaborate and learn from each other all the time. Are there any other examples that you could give us?
I mean, I guess quickly, one of the things that, whilst we're doing open invitations, I may not actually be allowed to do this open invitation, but we'll go with it anyway.
Punt it while you're here, be fine.
So, one of the groups that has come together through Better Buildings Partnership is an owner-occupier forum. And what we're doing, and it came out of the process of pulling together the climate commitment, and what it's doing is bringing a variety of different occupiers from various different sectors together with owners to actually get them in the same room, be that a virtual room or in person, to actually talk about some of the barriers that John was referring to earlier on. So, as an example of one of the work streams that's come out of that, it's around sort of data sharing protocols and sort of coming out of that sort of really formal environment of the green lease and starting to sort of talk about, how we can actually share more information and sort of, learn together and, start to remove some of those barriers. And you know, we've had some really great take up, but it's something that I think it's really gathering momentum now, and I think it's sort of a good example of how the industry is really coming together, but also that the property owners realise that this is a problem we need to break down and we need to try and find a solution for. And I'm going to let John come up with another one.
Well punted. Well punted. Yeah, the one that was going to come to my mind, and do sign up if you can. Speak to Janine afterwards. One of the ones that I was going to mention is the community that sits around the buildings. I think that's quite a, you know, outside of the sort of the internal community of occupiers and tenants, the external part of it, because our buildings are part of the neighbourhood fabric, and that's one of the things that, as any conscientious property owner will be all too aware of, is that it's not just us, it's everybody, and how any of the activities that we undertake or our tenants undertake, how they impact, but likewise how they should benefit the local economy, the local social fabric and infrastructure, and what it's doing to generate some kind of, if not a great deal of positivity and benefit for that local community. And that takes a number of different areas, whether that is financial support or professional support, or indeed just taking part in local initiatives to make sure projects get off the ground, they work, and just generally playing a part, as opposed to, you know, our names aren't up in lights in terms of, you know, of a high street brand. You can walk past one of our buildings and have no idea who owns it, but that shouldn't necessarily stop us from playing an active part in and amongst that. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks, John. Right, I'm going to open up the floor to some questions.
Just want to ask the panel, but perhaps particularly Damien, how we balance the quest for, you know, sorting out the environment with desecrating the built environment. And it seems, you know, to me as someone who works in the built environment, but is an outsider of this West End core, that any building that isn't protected, you know, it's just allowed to be knocked down and redeveloped with, you know, the support of the Mayor of London, and there doesn't even seem to be often an attempt to try and retrofit, or if it is possible, then it's, you know, considered too difficult. And, you know, we walk along Oxford Street and there are loads of new buildings which I fear are architecturally very faddy, and, you know, are we going to end up with these dated, you know, situation like we had coming out of the 1950s and 60s, all these, you know, dated buildings, and all the amazing historic buildings would have been gone. And of course the building on everyone's, you know, tongue this week is the proposal for the M&S building, which to me is, you know, it's a real sadness. Just wanted to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think you alluded to in your question that it's trying to strike a balance between the heritage conservation decisions, the sustainability drivers, of which obviously I'm very interested in, but also the wider considerations that have to be considered in the planning framework as well. Obviously, in my position, I have the kind of benefit of looking purely from a sustainability perspective. Colleagues within planning would have to weigh up the full scope of policy drivers and decisions within the planning framework. We are seeking to encourage and promote the reuse and refitting of buildings. We understand that by knocking down a building and rebuilding, you're obviously wasting the embodied carbon and energy that was already put into that building in the first place, as well as having the additional carbon impacts of the new build going forward. In many cases, it is appropriate to try and encourage retrofit, and as I've already mentioned, in terms of the planning framework and guidance, we're trying to really shift the position on that and encourage applicants and developers to consider more the opportunities around retrospectively enhancing and refurbishing buildings. That said, there are wider policy considerations from a planning perspective as well, in terms of economic sustainability, in terms of the demands and drivers to provide new homes, new further accommodation that can't always be addressed within the constraints of the existing building. So it is striking a balance. sustainability is very much at the core of where the council wants to be going forward. The climate emergency is a significant commitment, and through the city plan policies and through the supplementary guidance, we're really looking to move that forward and encourage that debate. It's very much a fast-paced and quite technically challenging area at the moment, and I think in many cases the understanding and learning and knowledge is trying to keep pace with the policy drivers in this space. It's not straightforward at all, but I can assure you that sustainability remains a key consideration, but it is one of many considerations from a planning aspect.
Thanks, Damien. And Tamir, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really important question, and it's a question that I think might be on the probably on the lips of many people in the room. Let's be honest. And if I may, Damien, I thought that was a very, very good answer. And using a cricketing analogy, I thought that was a flying catch, sort of on the boundary. But just there's a few points that you made that, well, two things really. One is it easy to look at redevelopment proposals? And I'd say, I've had probably 2 pre-application meetings, not with Westminster, with other boroughs in central London this week on those types of projects. Buildings that are 1950s, I really would say not of any particular heritage value, and I think the council agrees with us on those points. But it's not easy. There's been a step change and I would answer this question in the way I'd advise a client. If you are looking at a proposal for a redevelopment which involves demolition of a building, you are going to have a very, and the GLA policy also pushes you in this direction, you have to have a very strong and robust argument as to the reason why that's the case, and with an options analysis, looking at the retrofit and potential other opportunities or options before you even get to the principle of redevelopment. And that's a fundamental part. So my advice to clients at the moment is you need to go in eyes wide open that is the process you're going to go through. The other point that you made, and maybe the sustainability point and others, because it's a deeply complex question and answer in those respects, is when we talk about different types of buildings and whether they, how they relate to the West End or any city across the country, there has always been these things come down to your own judgment. Last year there was a whole discussion around beauty and what beauty means in the planning process, because beauty is now forming part of national policy. And beauty, frankly, means different things to different people, depending on your individual experience, depending on how your education, depending on where you've lived. And so people will always have different views on what is of value, what's a good form of architecture and what isn't. And those debates in architecture and in architectural history have been ongoing for years. So the purpose is make sure that there is policy in place to make sure that, and the conservation and design officers at Westminster will be pushing towards to make sure that you have a development that is of the highest quality. And I'll probably hand over on the sustainability point.
I know we need to wrap up, but I think it's just worth adding, and John may want to comment as well, is that typically it's easier to do new build. And policy is really starting to challenge that, which is absolutely the right direction of travel. And I think that we should all be looking at retrofit first, and I think that happily that's the place that more generally developers are starting with, which is a great sort of shift on. I think that there are things that can be done to make life easier, and John and I both sit on numerous forums where we spend time scratching our heads as to how we can deal with issues on things like warranties and insurance, which would actually make retrofit a lot easier. So use of timber, we're working on a project at the moment as well where we're trying to move steel from one build, or we're going to take it out of one building and put it into another. It's an incredibly complex process because of warranties. We couldn't even get some fire retardant paint warranted by a manufacturer, so we've had to strip it off, and that also adds carbon to our total carbon number. So what I would say is that there are no easy answers, and it's absolutely right that we continue to be, I don't know where you are, sir, but it's absolutely right that these questions continue to be thrown at us, But also, what we also need is the same questions to be thrown at the insurance companies and various other actors who sort of drive what we can develop and what we can lease to our customers.
Yeah, it's planning policy is moving us in the right direction, but that's not, planning policy shouldn't be the only thing that's moving us. And it's very much a case of when we're, and any of our organisations are looking at it, and you can look at it externally from a head and a heart perspective, and you say which one do you feel, and as Timmer mentioned, the concept of beauty and which architecture is better than another architecture. Also taking into account this sort of discussion is more than meets the eye, as Janine sort of mentioned. What sits behind these sorts of decisions is a whole complicated web of gives, takes, what's best, what's not best. Is the supply chain able to support us to do something like this? I just mentioned about something about fire retardant paint, for goodness sake. I mean, is that going to stop a whole process? Yes, it does. And you'd think to yourself, well, can't we all just be grown up and get over this? But unfortunately, sometimes it doesn't work that way. So I would definitely say that whilst the M&S building in particular is currently in focus and in frame, I think it's a case of there is more than meets the eye with these decisions. And we also need to appreciate that not every building built is a great or a good building. We have some buildings that really do perform badly, and ultimately there isn't much in the way of rehabilitation that you can do to it to make it work any better. But that's not saying said that other buildings, that refurbishment will be the breath of life to it, and it'll be a fantastic future asset. So again, it's not something that people do take lightly or indeed are not held to account. But as Janine said, the more we keep pushing and the more we keep asking the hard questions, the better the outcome we'll get.
And what I'll just finish on by saying is, particularly with that last question, isn't it refreshing that we are actually having these discussions now? Because I'm sure that wouldn't have come up a couple of years ago. So keep challenging us. Thank you so much to our panellists, and enjoy the rest of your day.